The Valkyrie warship appeared above Relay Station Oryx 7 without any warning at all. One moment the station was peaceful, and the next moment everything changed forever. The massive ship blocked out the stars like a dark cloud covering the sun. And every soul on board knew exactly what it meant. The Valkyrie Dominion had arrived, and with them came terror itself. Commander Thiza Vaughn stood at the head of her invasion force as the docking bay doors opened with a terrible hiss. She was tall even for her species, and her scales gleamed like polished obsidian under the station lights. 4 arms hung at her sides, and each one ended in claws that could tear through metal. Her eyes were the color of dried blood, and they missed nothing at all. She had conquered 17 stations before this one, and she had never needed to fire a single shot. The Valkyrie reputation did all the work for them. Every species in the known galaxy knew the stories. The Dominion had never lost observes war, and they had never shown mercy, and they had never been challenged by anyone who lived to tell about it. The station's security chief had surrendered within minutes of the ship's arrival. He had handed over the codes and the weapons in his own dignity without even being asked. Thiza had seen this happen many times before, and she found it both useful and disgusting. Now, she walked through the station's central atrium where her soldiers had gathered the captives. 63 beings from 11 different species sat huddled together on the cold metal floor. Quillari diplomats with their long necks and trembling antennae pressed against each other for comfort. Phoenix traders with their fox-like faces and bushy tails had gone completely silent. Warath engineers sat with their massive stone-colored bodies hunched over as if trying to become invisible. Fear hung in the air like a thick fog, and Thiza breathed it in with satisfaction. She walked among them slowly and let her presence sink into their minds. This was the art of conquest, and she had mastered it completely. You did not need to kill everyone when you could simply make them believe that resistance was impossible. You broke their spirits first, and their bodies would follow without complaint. Her blood-red eyes scanned the crowd and cataloged each reaction. The Quillari ambassador was already weeping quietly. A Phoenix merchant was muttering prayers under his breath. 3 Borath had closed their eyes as if hoping this was all just a bad dream. All of this was exactly what Thiza expected to see. But then her gaze fell upon something unexpected, and she stopped walking entirely. A human male sat apart from the others near the far wall. He was not huddled or trembling or praying. He sat cross-legged on the floor with his back straight and his hands busy. Those hands were running through the fur of a 4-legged creature that sat beside him with its tongue hanging out happily. Thiza consulted her translator implant and learned that the creature was called a dog. It was a Terran companion animal, and this particular one was a German shepherd named Rex. The human's name was Marcus Cole, and he held the rank of senior technician. He had been traveling to a new posting when the Valkyrie ship intercepted the station. None of this information explained why he was so calm. Thiza activated her bioscanner and read his vital signs. His heart rate was only slightly elevated. His breathing was steady and controlled. His body temperature was completely normal. Every other being in this room was showing extreme stress responses, but this human seemed almost relaxed. She watched him scratch behind the dog's ears, and the animal's tail wagged with pure joy. The human smiled at his pet and whispered something too quiet for the translator to catch. The dog licked his hand in response. How was this possible? Thiza had studied humans before her mission. She knew they were considered a young species with no significant military power. They had only been part of galactic society for a few generations. They should have been terrified like everyone else. But this one was not terrified at all. She watched his eyes move around the room, and she realized something that made her scales tighten with unease. He was not looking at the guards with fear. He was looking at them with assessment. He was studying their positions and their weapons and their patterns of movement. He was gathering information like a soldier preparing for battle. Yet his body language remained completely relaxed. His face showed no aggression. He simply sat with his dog and watched and waited. The other captives had begun to notice him too. A Quillari diplomat stared at the human with confusion. A Phoenix trader leaned over and whispered to his companion while pointing. The contrast between the human's calm and everyone else's terror was becoming impossible to ignore. Thesa made a decision right then and there. She would watch this one very carefully. She would learn what made him different. And then she would break him in front of all the others. Because that was the most important lesson of conquest. You always had to break the strongest one first. You had to show everyone that no one was immune to fear. You had to crush hope before it could spread. She turned to her second-in-command and spoke in a low voice that only he could hear. "The human is interesting," she said. "Make sure he stays healthy. I want him fresh when I decide to make an example of him." Her officer nodded and moved away to pass on the orders. Thesa took one last look at Marcus Cole before she left the atrium. He had stopped petting the dog and was now looking directly at her. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and something strange passed between them. It was not hatred, and it was not fear. It was something she had never seen before in a captive's eyes. It took her a moment to identify what it was. Recognition. He saw her as a threat, but also as something that could be understood and predicted, and ultimately overcome. He looked at her the way a hunter looks at dangerous prey. He respected the danger, but he was not controlled by it. Thesa felt a tiny crack form somewhere deep inside her confidence. She pushed the feeling down immediately and told herself it meant nothing. He was just one human with one small animal. He could not possibly change anything. She walked out of the atrium and returned to her command post. She had a station to control and captives to process and reports to file. The human would still be there when she was ready to deal with him. But as she worked through the night, something kept pulling at her attention. She found herself checking the surveillance feeds more often than necessary. She found herself watching the human sleep with his dog curled up against his chest. And she found herself wondering what exactly made this creature so dangerously different from all the others. 3 days passed under Velcari occupation, and the station became a prison of broken spirits. Commander Thesa Vaughn did not believe in physical torture. She found it wasteful and crude and far less effective than the alternative. The body could heal from wounds, but the mind carried scars forever. So she employed psychological warfare with surgical precision and watched her captives crumble one by one. Every morning her guards would select someone at random from the crowd. They would drag that person to the center of the atrium and force them to kneel. Then they would make that person say terrible things about their own species. They would make them beg for mercy. They would make them thank the Velcari for conquering them. The first day they chose a Quillari diplomat named Vess. She had been an ambassador for 40 years, and she had negotiated treaties that ended wars. But by the end of that morning, she was sobbing on the floor and calling herself worthless. She crawled back to her people on her hands and knees. The second day, they chose a Phoenix merchant named Tao. He'd been proud of his business and his family name. But the guards made him confess to crimes he had never committed. They made him denounce his own children as inferior beings. When they released him, he sat alone and refused to speak to anyone. The third day, they chose a young Borith engineer named Keth. He was barely an adult by his species standards, and his fear was so strong that he could not even stand. The guards laughed as he trembled and cried. They made him repeat phrases that shamed his entire culture. Each public humiliation sent waves of despair through the captives. They began to understand that survival was not guaranteed. They began to understand that obedience might not be enough. The Valkyrie could do whatever they wanted, and no one was coming to save them. Some captives started to break in different ways. The Quelari ambassador, who had wept on the first day, now sat in complete silence with empty eyes. A Phoenix trader approached the guards and offered to betray shipping routes in exchange for favorable treatment. The Barath huddled in corners and refused to look at anything or anyone. Hope was dying in the atrium, and Thesa could smell its decay like rotting fruit. But through all of this, Marcus Cole sat with his dog and said nothing. He watched the humiliations with steady eyes. He shared his food rations with Rex every day, even though the portions were barely enough for one. He petted the dog's fur and whispered to it, and seemed to exist in a bubble that the despair could not penetrate. The other captives began to resent him for it. On the third night, a Quelari named Sen crawled over to where the humans sat. Her antennae were flat against her skull with exhaustion, and her voice cracked when she spoke. "Why do you act like this?" she demanded. Marcus looked up from Rex with calm eyes. "Act like what?" he asked. "Like nothing is wrong. Like we are not all going to die. Like that animal matters more than our survival." The human considered her words for a moment before answering. His hand never stopped moving through the dog's fur. "They will probably kill Rex," he said quietly. "They will probably make me watch. I know this already." Sen stared at him with confusion. "Then why do you still care for it? Why do you waste food on it? Why do you act as if this nightmare is just a temporary inconvenience?" Marcus met her eyes, and something in his gaze made her flinch. "Because it is temporary," he said. "Everything is temporary. The Valkyrie think they have won, but they have not. They think they have broken us, but they have not. They've only broken the parts of us that were already weak." "You are insane," Sen whispered. "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "But I am also still myself. Can you say the same?" Sen had no answer for that question. She crawled back to her people and did not speak to the human again. Commander Thesa watched this exchange through the surveillance system. She sat in her command chair and replayed the conversation 3 times. The human's continued composure irritated her in ways she could not fully explain. It felt like an insult. It felt like a challenge. It felt like something that needed to be crushed immediately. She had been patient long enough. On the 4th day, she decided to break Marcus Cole personally. She would do it in front of everyone. She would show the entire room that no one was immune to Valkyrie dominance. She would destroy that calm confidence and leave nothing but a hollow shell behind. She ordered her guards to bring the human to the center of the atrium. They grabbed him by the arms and dragged him forward while Rex barked and tried to follow. Another guard held the dog back with a metal pole around its neck. Every captive in the room watched. Some with fear, and some with curiosity, and some with bitter satisfaction. The human who had stayed so calm was finally going to learn what everyone else already knew. Thesa descended from her observation platform and walked slowly toward her target. Her forearms were folded behind her back, and her blood-red eyes gleamed with anticipation. She stopped directly in front of Marcus and looked down at him with cold contempt. "Your creature," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "It serves no purpose. It produces nothing. It contributes nothing. It is a waste of the resources we provide." Marcus said nothing, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "You have fed it from your own rations," Thesa continued. "You have given it water and comfort and attention. All of this is inefficient. All of this is weak. We do not tolerate weakness in our territories." She gestured to 2 guards, who began walking toward Rex. The dog growled at them, but could not escape the pole around its neck. Its eyes kept looking back at Marcus with confusion and trust. "We will dispose of this creature now," Thesa announced. "You will watch. You will not resist. You will understand finally that everything you love can be taken from you. You will understand that you have no power here. The captives held their breath. The guards moved closer to the dog. Thesa watched Marcus Cole's face for the first sign of breaking. But what she saw instead would change everything. Something shifted in the human's eyes. Something cold and hard and absolutely unbreakable. It was not anger, and it was not fear. It was something far more dangerous than either. It was decision. Marcus Cole had made up his mind about something, and whatever it was had transformed him completely. He stood taller even though he had not moved. He seemed larger even though his body was the same. The air around him felt different somehow. Thesa felt the tiny crack in her confidence widen into something she did not want to examine. What was this human about to do? What happened next would be studied by Velkari military experts for generations to come. Marcus Cole did not beg for mercy. He did not bargain for his dog's life. He did not threaten or curse or weep. He did not freeze in place like a frightened animal. He simply stood up. The movement was so casual and so confident that the guards holding his arms actually released him. They had been trained to expect resistance or submission, but this was neither. This was something their minds could not process. Marcus walked over to his dog with calm, measured steps. He knelt down and gently removed the metal pole from around Rex's neck. The dog immediately pressed against his leg with a soft whine. Marcus scratched behind his ears and whispered something that no one else could hear. Then he picked up the leash. Commander Thesa watched with growing confusion. What was this human doing? Did he think he could simply walk away? Did he not understand that he was surrounded by armed soldiers? Did he not see the weapons pointed at him from every direction? Marcus Cole straightened up with the leash in his hand. He looked around the room once as if checking something. Then he began to walk toward the exit. He did not run. He did not charge. He simply walked at a normal pace with his dog at his side. His shoulders were relaxed and his stride was steady. He moved as if the guards and the weapons and the commander herself simply did not exist. He moved as if the outcome was already decided. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the room made a single sound. The guards were confused because this situation did not fit any of their training. Prisoners either submitted or they fought. They did not simply ignore their captors and walk away. The guards looked at each other and waited for someone to give an order. Thesa found that she could not speak. Her mind was trying to understand what was happening, and it kept failing. This human was not armed. He had no chance of escape. He must know that he would be stopped. So why was he walking as if none of that mattered? The other captives stared at the human with wide eyes. They had spent 3 days learning that resistance was impossible. They had watched their friends and colleagues broken in front of them. They had accepted that they were helpless. But now they watched a single human with a single dog walk through a room full of apex predators. They watched him ignore every rule they had learned. They watched him refuse to accept the narrative that had been written for them. And something inside them began to shift. The Quillari ambassador named Sen was the first. She had called Marcus insane just hours ago. She had mocked his attachment to his pet. But now she watched him walk and something woke up inside her chest. It was small and weak, but it was real. She remembered who she had been before the occupation. She remembered negotiating treaties and commanding respect. She remembered being someone who mattered. Sen stood up. Her legs trembled beneath her, but they held. Her antennae rose from her skull for the first time in days. She did not walk toward the exit. She simply stood there and refused to kneel anymore. 2 Phoenix traders saw her stand, and something passed between them. They had spent their whole lives calculating risks and rewards. They knew the numbers were against them. But they also knew that some things were worth more than survival. They stood up together. Then a Barath engineer named Kath rose to his feet. This was the same young male who had trembled and cried during his humiliation. But now his massive body straightened and his stone-colored face hardened with resolve. He was still afraid, but he was done letting fear control him. 3 more Boroth stood behind him. Then 5 more. Then 10. The standing spread through the room like fire through dry grass. Quillari, Phoenix, and Boroth rose one by one. They did not speak, and they did not attack. They simply stood up and looked at the guards. There were 63 captives and only 12 guards. The mathematics had always been in the captives' favor, but they had never realized it before. Fear had kept them on the floor. Fear had convinced them they were powerless. But Marcus Cole had not asked them to follow. He had not given a speech or made a plan. He had simply pulled a leash and walked. And somehow that small act of refusal had reminded 62 other beings that submission was a choice. They could choose differently. Commander Thesa finally found her voice. "Stop," she commanded. Her forearms unfolded and her claws extended. "All of you will sit down immediately. Anyone who remains standing will be executed." Nobody sat down. The captives looked at each other and then at the guards. They saw the uncertainty in Velkari eyes. They saw weapons that were suddenly outnumbered. They saw the cracks forming in a reputation that had seemed unbreakable. Marcus Cole had stopped near the exit. Rex sat calmly at his heel, as if this was just another walk in the park. The human turned and looked back at the room with quiet satisfaction. He had not planned any of this. He had simply decided that he would not watch his dog die while doing nothing. He had decided that he would rather die on his feet than live on his knees. He had pulled a leash because it was the only thing he could do. But sometimes the only thing you can do is exactly the right thing. Thesa felt cold spreading through her chest. This was not how conquest was supposed to work. This was not how inferior species were supposed to behave. One human had done nothing more than walk, and now her entire psychological strategy was collapsing. She turned to her guards and saw the doubt in their faces. They were apex predators who had never been challenged. They had conquered worlds through fear alone. But fear only worked if the enemy believed in it. These captives did not believe anymore. "What are your orders, Commander?" her second asked nervously. His weapon was raised, but his aim kept shifting. There were too many targets and not enough soldiers. Thesa opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in her military career, she had no idea what to do. And in that silence, the balance of power shifted forever. The captives did not charge or attack. They did not need to. They simply stood together and waited. They had found something that 3 days of psychological warfare had tried to destroy. They had found their courage again. And it had all started with a human and a dog and a simple leather leash. The standoff in the atrium stretched into its second hour, and the tension grew thicker with every passing minute. 63 captives stood facing 12 Velkari guards. Nobody moved and nobody spoke, but everyone understood that something fundamental had changed. The old rules no longer applied, and new rules had not yet been written. Commander Thesa Vaughn paced back and forth like a caged predator. Her forearms kept clenching and unclenching. Her blood-red eyes darted from the standing captives to her uncertain guards and back again. She was trying to find a way to regain control, but every option seemed wrong. She could order her soldiers to open fire. They would kill many captives before being overwhelmed. But they would be overwhelmed eventually because the numbers were simply too unequal. And even if they won, the Dominion would lose. Word would spread that the Velkari had been forced to use lethal force against unarmed prisoners. Their reputation for effortless dominance would be damaged forever. She could order a tactical retreat. Her soldiers could fall back to the docking bay and wait for reinforcements. But that would mean admitting defeat. That would mean showing the galaxy that one human and one dog had driven back the mighty Valkyrie. The political consequences would be catastrophic. She could try to negotiate. But negotiate what? The captives had no demands and no leaders. They were simply standing there and refusing to kneel. How do you negotiate with people who want nothing except to not be broken? The Quillari ambassador named Sen stepped forward. Her legs were no longer trembling, and her voice was clear. "Stand down," she said to the guards. "All of you, put your weapons on the floor. You have no authority here," Thesis snarled. "You are prisoners." "We were prisoners," Sen agreed. "Now we are simply people who outnumber you." The human reminded us of something important, Commander. You cannot control those who refuse to be controlled. Thesis turned her furious gaze toward Marcus Cole. The human still stood near the exit with his dog sitting calmly at his feet. He had not said a word since the standoff began. He had simply watched and waited as if he knew exactly how this would end. "You," Thesis growled as she stalked toward him. "You did this. You turned them against us." "No," Marcus replied calmly. "I just walked. They did the rest themselves. You knew what would happen. You planned this." Marcus shook his head. "I did not plan anything. I just decided I would not watch Rex die without doing something. I decided that I would rather be shot walking than kneel and beg. The rest was not up to me. That is impossible. One person cannot change everything. One person can remind others of what they already knew," Marcus said. "Your power was always an illusion, Commander. It only worked because everyone believed in it. I stopped believing, and then they stopped believing. The illusion broke." Thesis felt rage building inside her chest. This human spoke as if he had done nothing special. He spoke as if anyone could have done what he did. Did he not understand how dangerous his actions were? Did he not realize he could have died? "Why?" she demanded. "Why risk your life for that animal? It is just a beast. It cannot understand what you did for it." Marcus looked down at Rex and smiled. The dog looked back up at him with pure trust in its eyes. Its tail wagged gently as if everything was perfectly fine. "He understands enough," Marcus said. "He understands that I am his human and he is my dog. He understands loyalty and love and courage. Maybe he understands those things better than most people do." "Sentiment," Thesis spat. "Weakness." "No," Marcus replied. "Strength. The strongest thing in the universe is something worth fighting for. You Valkyrie have forgotten that. You conquer and dominate, but you have nothing worth protecting. You win wars, but you have no one to come home to." The words hit Thesis like a physical blow. She thought of her empty quarters on the warship. She thought of the long years of conquest with nothing waiting at the end. She thought of the hollow victory that each new station represented. Was the human right? Had she been missing something all along? She pushed the thought away and focused on the immediate crisis. The standoff could not continue forever. Something had to give. Then the alarms began to scream. Red lights flashed throughout the station, and a computerized voice announced incoming ships. The Galactic Union Relief Fleet had arrived. Someone had managed to send a distress signal during the chaos, and help was finally here. Thesis checked her tactical display and felt her last hopes crumble. 7 Union warships surrounded the station. They outgunned her single vessel by a factor of 10. There was no possibility of escape and no possibility of victory. "Commander," her second said urgently. "What do we do?" Thesis looked around the atrium one last time. She saw the standing captives with their newfound courage. She saw her confused and demoralized guards. She saw the human with his dog still watching her with those calm, assessing eyes. She had lost. Not just this battle, but something far more important. She had lost the belief that Valkyrie dominance was inevitable. She had lost the certainty that fear would always win. "Lower your weapons," she ordered her soldiers. "We surrender." The guards obeyed without hesitation. They seemed almost relieved to have a clear order to follow. Their weapons clattered to the floor, and the sound echoed through the silent atrium. The captives let out a collective breath. Some of them collapsed back to the floor with exhaustion. Others embraced each other with tears streaming down their faces. A few simply stood in shock, unable to believe it was over. Marcus Cole knelt down and wrapped his arms around Rex. The dog licked his face enthusiastically, as if celebrating. The human buried his face in the thick fur and stayed there for a long moment. Commander Thesa walked toward him slowly. The captives parted to let her pass and watched with wary eyes. She stopped a few feet away and looked down at the human and his pet. "Your species is very strange," she said quietly. Marcus looked up and met her eyes. There was no hatred in his gaze and no triumph. Just the steady calm that had started everything. "We get that a lot," he replied. Thesa almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she turned away and went to meet the Union soldiers who were already boarding the station. She had a surrender to negotiate and a career to end. But somewhere deep inside, she knew that this day had changed her forever. She would never forget the human who pulled a leash and dragged an entire room's courage out with it. 3 months passed, and the story spread across 4 sectors of known space. It traveled through trading posts and military bases and diplomatic gatherings. It passed from merchant to merchant and soldier to soldier and politician to politician. Each time it was told, it grew larger and a little more legendary. A human and his dog walked through a room full of Valkyrie predators. The predators did not know what to do. 62 other beings found their courage and stood up. The mighty Dominion was forced to surrender. The story changed things in ways that nobody had expected. The Valkyrie Dominion began a complete revision of their psychological warfare doctrine. Their High Council spent weeks analyzing what had gone wrong at Relay Station Oryx 7. They brought in experts and strategists and behavioral scientists. They reviewed every moment of surveillance footage. The conclusion was uncomfortable but undeniable. Their entire strategy was built on one assumption that had proven false. They had assumed that fear was absolute and unbreakable. They had assumed that once a species accepted domination, it would never resist again. But the human had shown that fear was just another obstacle. He had shown that courage could be rediscovered. He had shown that one person refusing to kneel could inspire thousands of others to stand. The Dominion quietly began pulling back from several contested territories. They stopped making threats they were not prepared to enforce. They started treating other species with something that almost resembled respect. The galaxy noticed this change and wondered what it meant. Ambassador Sen of the Quelari gave a famous speech to the Galactic Senate. She stood before representatives of 100 species and told them exactly what had happened in that atrium. She described the humiliations and the despair and the moment when everything changed. "We had forgotten who we were," she said. "We had accepted a story written by our enemies. We believed we were weak and helpless and doomed." But Marcus Cole did not accept that story. He wrote his own story instead. And in doing so, he reminded us that we could write our own stories too. The speech was broadcast to billions of beings across the galaxy. It became required viewing in schools and military academies. It sparked debates about the nature of courage and resistance and hope. The Phoenix Trading Consortium adopted a new policy of collective resistance. They declared that any attack on one Phoenix ship would be treated as an attack on all Phoenix ships. They formed mutual defense pacts with species they had never worked with before. The lesson of Oryx 7 had taught them that unity was stronger than isolation. The Barath engineers formed the first cross-species labor union. They called it the Standing Together Association, and its membership grew every month. Workers from dozens of species joined together to protect each other from exploitation. The young Borath named Keth became one of its founding leaders. When asked why he had joined the union, Keth always told the same story. "I was so afraid," he would say. "The Valkyrie broke me, and I thought I would never be whole again. But then I watched a human stand up for his dog. He did not ask anyone to follow him. He just walked. And I thought if he can do that, then maybe I can do something too. Maybe we all can." The Galactic Union added a new entry to their species database. Under the file for humanity, they included a special note about psychological resilience. The note read as follows: "When analyzing human psychological characteristics, attention should be given to the RX-7 incident. This species appears to possess an unusual capacity to reject environmental cues that indicate submission is required. They demonstrate remarkable ability to maintain internal psychological coherence under extreme external pressure. Further study is recommended, although direct confrontation is strongly discouraged." The note was updated several times over the following years. Each update added new examples of humans refusing to accept defeat. Each update made the recommendation against confrontation stronger. Marcus Cole became famous whether he wanted to or not. News services from across the galaxy requested interviews. Universities offered him speaking positions. Several species wanted to give him medals and honors and titles. He declined everything. He returned to his posting as a mid-level technician on a quiet research station. He walked Rex every morning before his shift and every evening after dinner. He lived a simple life and seemed perfectly content with it. When reporters tracked him down, he was always polite, but never interested in fame. When asked why he had done what he did, his answer was always the same. "Rex needed me," he would say. "That is all. He was in danger, and I could not just sit there." Anyone would have done the same. The reporters would point out that 62 other beings had been sitting there. They would ask what made him different. They would push for some deeper explanation. Marcus would just shrug and scratch Rex behind the ears. "Maybe they just needed to be reminded," he would say. "Maybe they forgot that they had a choice. I did not do anything special. I just chose." Commander Thesivorn retired from military service. Her surrender at RX-7 had ended her career, but she found that she did not really mind. The long years of conquest had left her empty, and the defeat had given her something to think about. She spent her retirement writing a detailed analysis of what had happened. Her final report was classified at the highest levels, but one paragraph was eventually leaked to the public. The human did not win because he was stronger or smarter or better armed. He won because he decided simply and completely that the outcome was not yet determined. He looked at a situation that seemed hopeless, and he refused to accept that it was hopeless. This is the human gift and the human weapon. They do not accept the narrative others write for them. They pick up the leash and walk. They make their own story, even when everyone tells them it is impossible. I have conquered many species in my career, but I do not think the Valkyrie will ever truly conquer humanity. You cannot defeat a people who do not believe in defeat. The paragraph was quoted in textbooks and speeches and philosophical treatises. It became one of the most famous descriptions of humanity ever written by an alien. Years later, a statue was erected on Relay Station RX-7. It showed a human man walking with a dog at his side. The leash connected them like an unbreakable bond. Their eyes looked forward towards something only they could see. The plaque at the base of the statue was simple. It contained only one sentence. He pulled the leash and dragged the entire room's courage out with it. Visitors came from across the galaxy to see the statue and read the plaque. They would stand before it and think about what had happened in this place. They would ask themselves if they would have stood up too. And somewhere on a quiet research station far away, Marcus Cole would wake up each morning and walk his dog. Rex was getting older now, with gray around his muzzle and a slower step. But he still wagged his tail when he saw his human. He still pressed against Marcus's leg with perfect trust. They would walk together in the artificial sunlight, and neither of them cared about statues or fame or galactic politics. They had each other, and that was enough. That had always been enough. And that simple truth had changed everything.